All right, everybody, thank you. For those of you who are just joining us, thank you so much. It's good to see some familiar faces and some friendly faces as well. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation, especially given the times that we find ourselves in and everything that's happening around us. But more importantly, given the fact that this is nothing new, what we're seeing, these are things that have been happening for a very, very long time. And on the Canadian side, we often like to sometimes pass off as saying, the same thing is not happening here. But the truth is, if you've worked in our school system or if you've engaged with it directly, our education system, our justice system, our social system, if you engage with all of them at different levels, we are dealing with these same challenges in sometimes in very brutal ways, not because we don't see them, or not because we've become so passive about it that we don't acknowledge the impact it's having on those who are on the receiving end as victims. So I really want to thank everybody. Empowerment Squared, my name is Leo Johnson. I am the executive director of Empowerment Squared. And at Empowerment Squared, we see ourselves within this ecosystem of doing two things. One side of it is the side where we have to fight for justice, where we have to deal with the consequences of what's happening within our societies every day. But the other side is the building. While we're doing that with one hand, fighting for social justice and equality and equity, we have to be building with the other hand, because what we've seen consistently is the fact that whenever victories are won in the fight in anti-Black racism specifically, or whenever we hit some milestones, as a community, we are faced with the challenge being that we are not able to take advantage of the opportunities that emerge, simply because we've become so overwhelmed with the fight that it becomes impossible to build. So when we've made some real inroads or some real progress, we find that we end up right back to the same spot, simply because our communities were not afforded the access, the opportunities to build in ways that can allow us to take advantage. And that's where Empowerment Square have found itself as an organization, making sure that our children are not just getting access to post-secondary education, but quality post-secondary education, making sure we are not just telling them that it is possible, but providing them the practical access and means, everything from financial to mentoring, to education, to role modeling, to making sure they have access to caring and trusted adults and allies who can help them understand everything from their identity and how they see themselves within the ecosystem and the challenges they have to actually deal with. And at Empowerment Square, we do a series of programs, one of them being our academic mentoring program, which is the most popular one. We see anywhere between 150 to 250 young people all through the year. And we transition a number of them to post-secondary education. But beyond that, we also support the parents, because we realize that a lot of parents and adults in the Black community are also struggling in the same way. Sometimes their children get supported and the parents not. So we realize the importance of building families. We realize the importance that the foundation of our community is the family unit. So if we cannot find a way to empower the family unit, it makes it impossible. And all of this is done largely through donations and also through grants that we do get. And we want to be thankful to the community. Some of you online this evening have been donors for a long time of Empowerment Square. Some of you have been volunteers. Without your help, without your support, we would not be here. And we continue to rely on our support as an important part and a crucial part of our work in the long term. In the end, we're trying to build a community. We are not just trying to run programs, because the deficit that exists within our communities, the gaps that we have to cover, we take some real long-term building and not just running certain programs for a period of time. So on behalf of Empowerment Square, I want to thank everybody. I want to welcome everyone, and we look forward to working with all of you, whether it's through being a donor, or whether it's through being a volunteer, or just lending us your knowledge and your expertise. We will be grateful, and we would gladly receive it. This community needs all of us, regardless of where you find yourself on the ecosystem. We can all be parts of the solution. Our website information, everything will be up. So if you need to check out more information, feel free to do that anytime. Thank you very much, Alex, for affording me the opportunity.
Thank you, Leo, and welcome everyone to today's conversation. I am so excited to have this very important conversation about human rights and anti-Black racism in schools. So I'm just going to go through a bit of information just to preface the conversation, as well as to introduce some of our our hosts before turning it over to our facilitator. So again, the significance of today's conversation is about anti-Black racism and the impacts on students and families. But it's also for teachers and principals and other members of the community who want to be able to hold their colleagues and the institution of education itself accountable as well. So we hope this conversation creates some practical tools going forward. We hope to enlighten all participants in this conversation and hopefully make you more able to see the impact that you can have on the education system, generally speaking. So the context of our conversation again is about Ontario rules and laws. So it's not about any other jurisdiction, it's only about the laws in Ontario, and particularly the Education Act and Ontario's Human Rights Code. So many of the school boards across Ontario also have varying policies. However, we'll be referencing some policies that may have different names from board to board, but generally have the same purpose and same meanings. We'll have a chance for questions at the end. My facilitator, Miss Danielle Williamson, will be able to speak about this afterwards, but you can use the chat feature for questions, as well as Facebook Live. We're streaming live on there. So just one more thing to include from me. Today's conversation is only legal information and it's not to be considered legal advice. You can certainly follow up with any of the panelists afterwards if you have specific questions, and we'll give you some more information about how you'll be able to access legal services should you need so. But for the purposes of this conversation, it's only legal information that we will be providing and not legal advice. So today joining me are three wonderful women who have very much had an impact on the community. I'll introduce each of them one by one. Muna Bilay works at Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, and she's a Black Justice Youth Coordinator there. Patricia Solomon works with the Black Legal Action Center, and she is a great advocate for Ontario as a fight to combat anti-Black racism in a variety of institutions across the province. And then finally, Danielle Williamson is a part of ACA, African Canadian Caribbean, I'm messing that up. Danielle will have
the Afro-Canadian Caribbean Association.
There we go, yeah, there we go. And she will be our facilitator for today. She's going to be leading our conversations and helping us engage in some very insightful questions and answers today. So Danielle, I will turn it over to you for now.
Oops, I do that all the time. It never gets old that I'm talking while I'm mute. So I would just like to welcome everybody to today's discussion. And just to kind of go over some housekeeping rules. We ask that you actually keep your mics muted, and also to preserve the bandwidth, and also too, because we are live on Facebook, we ask that your videos be turned off. Maybe towards the end when we are taking questions, you can turn your video on if you prefer that, if you wish to ask your question. As mentioned by Alex, we do have a chat feature here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. We have an Empowerment Squared volunteer, Hargan Graywall, who will be monitoring the Zoom chat and the Facebook Live chat. So we ask that if you do have any questions, to type them into the chat. Hargan will ensure that he sends it to me, and then therefore I could address it to the correct panelist. And we just ask that you stay engaged, and hopefully today's session that you will be walking away with some relevant information to assist you moving forward. So just to go over the agenda for today, the first part of the discussion, we will be looking at anti-Black racism in Ontario schools, then moving on to responsibilities of the school, so individual schools and also to the school boards. Part 3 of our conversation will be looking at advocating against anti-Black racism. Then we will be spending the rest of the session answering any questions that viewers in the audience may have, and then we will close with closing remarks. So again, please use the chat features if you have any questions, and we're just going to start. So with respect to anti-Black racism in Ontario schools, what is anti-Black racism? So anti-Black racism are policies and practices embedded within Canadian institutions that reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination that is directed at people of African descent and is rooted in the unique history and experiences of enslavement and colonization in Canada. So I'd actually just like to maybe throw it out to one of maybe you, Alex, just to kind of start the conversation, just with respect to this broad definition of anti-Black racism. Is there anything else that you would wish to add or expand on, and I guess even in today's current climate, what that actually looks like?
Yeah, anti-Black racism manifests in many different ways throughout the education system. I think most recently we saw de-streaming and its impacts in Ontario, and how we will be kind of managing that as a province together. I know Muna has a lot of information about that, and I'm going to turn it to Muna to speak a little bit more in depth about the manifestation of anti-Black racism in schools.
Thank you, Muna.
Thank you, Alex and Daniel. So I think first it'd be helpful to sort of understand what racism, like I think in order for us to talk about anti-Black racism, we must first understand racism, and that is defined as the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and abilities. So it's the idea that racial differences equate to a particular race being either superior or inferior. And the term itself, anti-Black racism, was first, I think, expressed by Dr. Akua Benjamin, Ryerson social work professor. And it's a segment essentially of racism. It's part of racism, and anti-Black racism itself is deeply also embedded in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices. It manifests itself through beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and or discrimination that is directed towards people of Black African descent. So these biases and stereotypes manifest themselves in various aspects of our society. They are seeped into our healthcare system, justice system, particularly in our criminal justice system, and in our education system. So when we talk about the ways in which anti-Black racism manifests itself in schools, well, we know that anti-Black racism is insidious in the way, as I said, it is steeped into our education system. We know that these behaviors include, negative stereotyping of Black students, racist incidents and name calling, lowered expectations of Black students, harsher punishment towards Black students when there's a conflict. And in talking about de-streaming, we must first know that what the reason why communities are advocating for de-streaming is because the policy of streaming, when it was introduced in 1999, was extremely problematic then. And so it took this long for officials, administrators, boards, and people who are able to make decisions to agree that this is a problem and it needs to change, right? So just quickly around streaming, in 1999, as I said, the Ontario Minister of Education introduced the Ontario Secondary Schools grade 9 to 12 program and diploma requirement policy, and that policy introduced the academic and applied course streams. So it was done in math, English, science, geography, and French courses in grade 9 and 10. So at a very young age, children were asked to sort of pick the stream in which they wanted to continue the rest of their education. career in high school. Parents who were involved would advocate at times, but you have to remember that while this policy was probably intended to provide options for all students, in fact, what it did is it streamed students, especially racialized Black students. And we know that this streaming impacts Black students disproportionately. And so asking, a grade 8 student to make a high school course choice between applied and academic courses, make a decision on choices that will impact students' educational pathways throughout high school, affect graduation rates, and often will influence post-secondary options, which can limit their career opportunities in future, is certainly problematic. And so because there was a huge, movement through communities to change and remove this policy, de-streaming was announced actually Monday, I think, right, Alex, by the education minister. Yes, Stephen Leslie, I want to say, I always forget how to pronounce his last name.
Stephen Lecce.
Lecce, thank you. So yeah, he announced that the practice would end, and in fact, he actually called streaming a systemic, racist, discriminatory practice, which I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the fact that, when this policy was established, Black communities have said this, have advocated about this, have, said that this was a huge problem to the success of children. And you have to take into consideration that, some cultures and newcomers and communities take the opinion and the position of teachers very strongly. And so parents in some communities will, expect that the teacher knows what's best. And so they will follow the lead of that teacher, then essentially ensuring that their child stays in applied courses. So I think that is wonderful to hear that, but I hope that's not the end of that conversation. And I know that, a spokesperson for the minister said that this full plan would eliminate streaming, which will be rolled out shortly and is expected to take effect by the 21-22 school year. We know that also Toronto School Board District has actually begun to phase out the practice, and we strongly encourage other boards to follow suit. It shouldn't take community members and advocates decades to signal, a red flag. Policymakers should do this brunt of work.
Thank you, Muna. Absolutely, I agree. So my follow-up question to that is, what is the significance of human rights and with respect to anti-Black racism? So I guess the intersectionalities.
Mm-hmm. So I think, the Ontario Human Rights Code says that case law recognizes that racial profiling is a systemic problem in policing, right? So we know that there's disproportionate ways that racial profiling harms Black youth. So you have now in your school officers that are patrolling or have access to these youth. They're from an institution that has been recognized to have a deep issue with profiling, with systemic racism within that culture. And so now you have these officers in this space with youth and children, and the purpose of officers is to look for crimes, to look for issues and address these concerns, right? So if you walk in with that mindset that and crimes that need to be addressed and looked at, then the response is always going to be one of an adversarial position. So we also know that schools have a duty to care for the well-being of these children while in their charge. This is not a space where children should be feeling unsafe or unwelcomed. School boards in Ontario are also under legal obligation to adopt, revise policies, guidelines, and procedures in accordance with the Education Act and regulations and the Provincial Code of Conduct. So this is the work that the school board needs to do. They need to understand that it is their duty to look after the care and the well-being of these kids. And having these kids be in the same space as officers, when these kids are saying that, you know, they're being racially profiled, they're being harassed. We have anecdotes that, you know, many youth in this city have shared with us, where they told us, you know, instances where they're being discriminated against, they're being questioned without the information being shared with their legal guardian or parents, without either of those guardians being available and present during that question period. Sometimes parents will find out of these issues months later, and we don't know what happens to that information that was collected from that child, right? And so that is what is at stake here, is the fact that these kids must be protected, their needs and their rights must be protected, because there are laws to protect the well-being of these children, the human rights of these children, right? The boards need to also take that into consideration and really think about who they are allowing in this space to have access to these kids, and in what environment are they essentially creating by not acknowledging the harm that they may be causing. Yeah.
Appreciated. And just even kind of taking it back to the initial question, like, again, anti-Black racism in Ontario and in many of our systems is deeply rooted. So even with respect to your explanation of the history of anti-Black racism in our school boards, like, I hope that it's a start, a jumping off point for us to really look at how we are going to, you know, pretty much blow up what's been happening and really ensuring that our youth are really receiving equitable and just education. So I really appreciate the conversation starting with respect to anti-Black racism and how that really seeps into other structures, and even to our second part of our discussion. I'd like for us to move on to responsibilities of the school in Ontario, or schooling education systems here in Ontario. So while anti-Black racism is felt by many members of our communities throughout Ontario, there are already mechanisms in place that are supposed to mitigate these systems in practice. Laws and policies are the means in which we are expected, or we expect the school systems to prevent anti-Black racism. So I'd actually like to pose a question to Alex. What is the role of schools in the perpetuation of anti-Black racism?
Yeah, and I think it's a very important question that we need to critically examine for a number of reasons. So Muna's already kind of established for us that anti-Black racism is real. We already know anti-Black racism is real, and she's shown that it manifests in schools on a day-to-day basis. Many of our participants who are teachers, students, parents, community members, you may have witnessed it or felt it yourself. Now the question is, how does this continue to persist in Ontario's education system? And is it that we just don't have the rules and mechanisms in place to prevent it? I would suggest no, and I think the law agrees with that. While we don't have explicit laws that necessarily mention anti-Black racism and ways to prevent it, there are certainly mechanisms in place that create a responsibility for schools and school boards to prevent anti-Black racism from occurring. And yet we still see the perpetuation of anti-Black racism despite many of these rules. So how is it that the school boards continue to perpetuate anti-Black racism? I think it's because of its inability or failure to uphold some of the laws themselves that would be used ideally to prevent it. So for example, section 169.1 subsection 1 of the Education Act is actually about promoting student achievement and well-being. It actually refers to two specific clauses or subsections in there that deal with inclusivity and the obligation by school boards to prevent bullying. So I'll start with the first one. So subsection A1 of 161.1 subsection 1 is about promoting a positive school climate that is inclusive and accepting of all pupils, including pupils of any race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, age, marital status, family status, or disability. Very broad, but it creates an obligation for schools to be inclusive. Now, if that's a starting point for all school boards to work through, then certainly there are many ways in which schools can positively impact students in a way that includes them. And yet we still see school boards with teachers that are overwhelmingly white, with boards that have students that are overwhelmingly racialized. How is it that the obligation at a legislative level includes inclusivity, and yet we don't see representation in teachers? How is it that there's this obligation for inclusivity when we don't have curriculum or classes that focus on the inclusive nature of the education that they are being taught? How is it that school boards in schools across Ontario optionally or choose to opt in or out of Black History Month activities? If inclusivity is a legislative standard and obligation by the Education Act in Ontario, then certainly the obligation and onus on school boards is to make sure at all levels they are trying actively to include members of the Black community and all racialized community in its curriculum, in its teaching staff, in everything that it does. Remember, it's a positive obligation. The word it says is to promote, and that is an active word. So when it comes to inclusivity, the legislation already mandates schools to do that. Secondly, in subsection A2 mentions there's an obligation to promote the prevention of bullying, which is specifically relevant when it comes to discriminatory practices, racial bullying, and very significant events that harm a Black child through anti-Black racism. So, like I said, the law already covers this as well. But if that was not enough, the Ministry of Education has actually come out with policies, and many teachers who are part of this conversation will be familiar with the term PPM, but it's a policy program memorandum, and PPM 144 is actually a little bit more detailed in terms of the explanation about school boards' obligations for bullying prevention. And they actually make specific reference to the importance of a positive school climate. The positive school climate is also an obligation that must be actively sought out. And that means that school boards have an obligation to prevent any discriminatory practices, not to, in hindsight, try to prevent it from happening again or be reactive to anything that pops up. No. Subsection A1 of, or A2 of section 169.1 of subsection 1, again, promotes student achievement and well-being. So when it comes to bullying prevention, school boards should be actively working to prevent events from happening. And yet we see things like students being called the N-word in class. What have teachers done as a result of that? It's questionable at best that schools can allow for that to happen, but also that they show no accountability. If we're talking about promoting safe, positive school environments, what are the mechanisms in place from schools to penalize that kind of behavior? Why is it still occurring? And we know, again, I'm going to keep referring to it, this legislation creates an obligation, a positive obligation to promote the student achievement and well-being. So I just said a lot, but I could keep going. But I just want to say one more thing about bullying and racial bullying and discrimination in schools. Bullying prevention is something in which all school boards have an obligation to lay a framework for. They have an obligation to create plans in place and how they are going to address it and assist students post-event and things of that nature. I believe it was last year in which there was an investigation conducted into, if it wasn't all of Canada, it was all of Ontario, and it looked at the underreporting of bullying in schools. But we know that bullying happens in schools. So why is it that school boards some school boards are reporting 0 incidents of bullying. And this goes back to my point about accountability. If there's no accountability, how do you adhere to your obligations to promote student achievement for well-being when you're not identifying these issues of racial bullying, particularly anti-Black racism in this conversation, and working towards ending that? Failure to even acknowledge it is in itself a breach of that legislative obligation. So that's my quick spiel about the role of perpetuating anti-Black racism in school.
Okay, so moving on to the second question that I have for you. So that's really like, the first question was really laying the foundation, but now we're asking about individuals in these school settings. So I guess the second part of my question would be, what are teachers' responsibilities with respect to addressing matters of anti-Black racism? So now we're looking at the educators.
That's right. Now, teachers have a huge obligation when it comes to anti-Black racism. There is case law that actually determines kind of the level of care that's required for an educator, a teacher. So if your duty is to perform teaching activities, there's a certain standard that you're expected to do it at. And the courts have held that the standard is that of a reasonably prudent parent. And what that essentially means is a teacher should be inquisitive about the state of a child, the health, the safety, all aspects of the child. You should be inquisitive as to their safety in school, especially if we're keeping it all in the context of promoting student achievement and well-being, and promoting a positive and safe environment. A reasonably prudent parent would make sure that their child is actually in a space in which all that is involved. So a teacher's standard of care is to make sure that their students are feeling safe. And that often requires to ask more questions, to learn about how they are being treated by their students, to have a very holistic view of the child and the students in their classroom. And yet we still see issues of anti-Black racism that results in injuries or bullying and very ugly words being said. Now, there's actually a case a few years ago that included a young racialized boy, Black boy, in the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. The case actually came to the conclusion that, and they spoke about the reasonably prudent parent standard that's expected of teachers. They found that it was a teacher's obligation and the school's obligation, the principal's obligation, to be aware of the bullying that this young man experienced. If obviously you can't read minds, and if a student chooses not to disclose that, it becomes a lot more difficult. But in this case, there were signs that the student was being bullied they were being bullied, and the context of that bullying was racism, anti-Black racism. But the school, there were many indications that this child was being bullied, but if they chose not to, they were unable to take the steps necessary to address that. So the case was actually found that the school breached their duty owed to the student, and as a result of that, they were held liable for breaching that standard. But when it comes back to teachers, there's this obligation that must be adhered to. And teachers have a unique role in society. It's one that many families trust, or community trusts them in general. And it's an interesting position. As a lawyer, as a practicing member of the Law Society in Ontario, and Muna is a paralegal, and Patricia is a lawyer, and we have an obligation to make the justice system better. We have to hold it to a particular standard, and that standard always has to be a very high one. So when I think about teachers, I think about their duties as well to the education system, and making that system standard incredibly high as well. So when I think about teachers in their role of advocating for students who may be experiencing these things in a system that doesn't necessarily help them out or speak for them, teachers play a crucial role in raising these issues. So teachers themselves play several different roles in the lives of students experiencing anti-Black racism, whether or not it's directly to prevent them from experiencing that, or to speak about these issues so other students and other people across Ontario are able to not experience those things as well.
Thank you. A few people in the chats agree that, you know, as teachers, there's that expectation of taking on that parenting figure in the education system. So following our teachers, with respect to the leadership of our schools, my follow-up question would be, what are principals' roles with or responsibilities with respect to anti-Black racism that's experienced in schools?
Yeah, that's right. So while teachers are in the classrooms interacting in principals play a more broader role in the ecosystem of a school, of course. And they have a duty to supervise and ensure that the teachers themselves are performing the standards expected of them. So in the same way I would expect teachers to hold each other accountable, one expects principals to hold their staff accountable. So this is accountable to the standard of care that's expected of them. For example, in an instance where a teacher has viewed or been present in an instance where a student has been called the N-word, that teacher choosing not to do something should be held accountable. If a principal is aware of teachers not abiding by their duty of care and not abiding by the legislative obligations to create a safe and positive environment, and remember, it's an active role. It's one in which you have to participate. It cannot be passive. Just simply not being racist is not enough. Not being vocal about this is not enough. You have to play an active role in preventing these things, and principals need to hold their staff in school accountable to this kind of behavior. And this is all within the context of all the laws that we have been describing, particularly as it's particularly we reference the Human Rights Code and discrimination, anti-Black racism, things like that. So there's an obligation to uphold those principles, those obligations to ensure that throughout their school, these things are not they're not affecting students negatively. Also, applying bullying prevention policies. Remember, we started off with saying that there's a failure to apply these principles, these bullying prevention policies, these ideas. Again, principals, their role is to be accountable, to hold their members accountable, and to ensure that the rules and laws are being upheld in their school. So essentially, accountability is their role when it comes to anti-Black racism. And teachers, we need to hold principals accountable to that as well, to make sure that all students can be in a safe and positive environment, free of discrimination.
So this seems to be like a hot topic for some of our viewers, and even I believe it's Robert Madray. He's shared in the chat that, you know, many teachers are afraid to speak up. And I guess with respect to administration. And then Gregory, I will kind of just give you the floor for 2 minutes, because I realized that you did say you wanted to say something with respect to the slide that Alex has, that we have here. So I will just kind of give you the floor so you can speak your piece. Gregory Donjan. Okay, so maybe Gregory, you figured it out? Okay.
I wasn't able to unmute. I'm not necessarily a host yet. But me and Batul we're both members of the HWDSB Kids Needs Help group. We've been doing this work. We've been doing anti-Black racism work within schools. The HWDSB Kids Needs Help have been doing work at the forefront of anti-Black racism, and some of my personal experiences in regards to principals combating anti-Black racism is that they rely on protocol that was based off of colonial views. So at the end of the day, they rely on the protocols, but at the same time, they are ignorant to challenging the protocols. So at the end of the day, whether or not they believe it is morally good for that student, they don't care. It's more or less a, okay, I just have to go with what I was told to do. More or less, it's a sense of them trying to say that um, them trying to say that they're doing what they're supposed to, that they're following the system, and then it's like they've been saying, like both the people in the chat and the students have been saying, it's also a sense of temporary appeasement once you do call out these big issues, or once you do try and talk to them about the anti-black racism that is perpetuated within their schools. It turns into a bigger issue of which they believe they have no control over. And I believe that holding them accountable as well as the higher level ups is what needs to happen. In regards to combating anti-black racism and principles, they have the ability to also hold the staff under them accountable. And I feel like they treat each as a principal within their school. They treat each instance as each incident as an individual incident, in regards to not even in regards to, as opposed to a bigger issue, and a stronger issue. I'm not sure if my colleague Batul has anything to say on the matter, but we also did push for the removal of SROs, and we also did see some work in that area. There's a ton of amazing work we've been doing as the HWDSB Kids Needs Help, and and when it comes to in the school, we've been facing the forefront, and we've seen it firsthand.
Maybe we can get your colleague Batul towards the end of our discussion, but I think it also too links back to one of Alex's initial points about these incidences are not being documented accurately, so therefore we're not collecting the data that we need. And then also too, it takes courageous leadership, but also too, what we've seen recently in the media, or just even in local school boards in our region, is that a lot of responsibility is falling on the leadership. And I think if we actually had courageous leadership at the top, then that would really give these administrators the principles to be having those courageous conversations with their staff. So I think it's like the data is needed, but then again, really leadership in those positions, really being courageous. I'm not too sure, Alex, if there's anything else that you would want to kind of state with respect to Greg's point, and then we're going to move on. Or Mona, go ahead. Go ahead, Mona.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to add a little bit on the point that Gregory made about the SROs. I think the removal, the termination of that program, for one, has to be acknowledged. That it was a momentous moment. Like, that took a lot of effort, a lot of work, and that was all because of the fact that young racialized kids within their schools knew that what was going on was not normal. It didn't feel right. They didn't feel welcome. They didn't feel safe. And because after years and years of expressing these concerns through the proper channels, mind you, they were not taken into consideration, and they were left with no other opportunities but to protest and, you know, have a really great social media campaign, collaborate with others that were sort of doing this kind of work. And without them, this, I think, wouldn't have taken place. We wouldn't have this conversation about SROs being removed and that program being terminated in the schools. Just to also note on the fact that many trustees didn't really know what the program was about. You know, many educators and parents didn't know what was the purpose even of having an officer within these halls. And this is something that went on for, I think, over 20 years, close to 25 years. So for essentially 2 decades, you have, an officer in this space with racialized children and all the baggage and racial heritage that comes with that. And now you're expecting that these officers may teach them about, safety and bullying and safe sex or what have you. Those are things that we heard they were supposed to be helping with. There are experts in the city who do this type of work all day, every day, and who are available to provide expert level information tailored to the minds of young people, and that can support them. And if the purpose is for young people to have a positive image of the police, well, we have to remember that the police has to have a positive relationship with the very communities that these young people are from. So I just really wanted to take that moment and acknowledge the work that took place for that to happen. And oftentimes the burden is on racialized communities and young people to step up and do the work because officials aren't listening, or, our feedback is taken as though it's only anecdotal. And when we provide statistics and data and report, there's still requests for consultations and trying to understand what these issues are. Well, the very lives of children at times are at stake within these walls. And I highly doubt if, you were at a decision-making position and you felt unsafe, or your child felt unsafe, that you would want to have months and months and years of consultation and meeting and learning and understanding and what have you, right? So the same thing that happened with right now, this idea of de-streaming, it's wonderful. And I see in the chat that some folks are saying it's only in grade 9, but the reality is it should be taking place in JK. The idea of streaming children based on what you believe they are good at is a fallacy. It's taking away from their opportunities to flourish, to be curious, and to really come into themselves. They're supposed to be learning and making errors and growing. And the same goes when you think about organizations or agencies that boards are inviting in these hallways. If these agencies view these same children as potential criminals, that is a problem. So I just wish that it was, we were done asking communities to not only acknowledge the gaps and the issues, but also come up with the solutions, right?
Yeah, and if I could just branch off of that, I know we're lingering on this, but I think it's a very important point as well. It's not about, these aren't trivial questions being asked. These aren't requests that can be considered. I think the point of this part of the series of conversation questions is that there is legislative obligations. This isn't a question of if or can or may you do this. No, you have an obligation. Remember, I said promote. It's a positive obligation that they have to ensure a positive school climate. So you should be doing this 2 weeks ago, a year ago, 3 years ago, decades ago. This is not a question about whether or not we can or can't do this going forward. It's a question about why are we still doing this? And as tax-paying citizens, Black people in Canada, Black people in Ontario have a right. We have the right to request that if our children, if our communities are being negatively impacted, things need to change. And this isn't, like I said, it's not a trivial request. This is the law. You are not following the law if you fail to provide a safe and positive environment for Black students.
Thank you, Alex. Absolutely, I agree. So I think this is a good launching off point for us to move into the third part of our discussion with respect to advocating against anti-Black racism. So again, despite the rules that are in place for schools and individuals to be held accountable, anti-Black racism still persists. So however, as citizens, we do have the ability, and there are resources there for us to advocate. So I'm going to actually ask Patricia to lead us for this part of the discussion as to, with respect to advocating against anti-Black racism, what is the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal? So I guess it's really starting off with an education and knowledge base before advocacy, and how to make use of this forum.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's really important in the context of education law that we not only stand up for ourselves and advocate, but oftentimes we need to litigate. So the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is an administrative tribunal here that hears and determines applications that are brought under an Ontario Human Rights Code violation. So some of those examples that my colleagues mentioned were based on race or disability, gender identity or expression, and the list really goes on, but I will focus on anti-Black racism for today. So if someone has an issue where they are not getting anywhere within the school board, the Teachers Association, Ontario College of Teachers, as a parent, guardian, student, and even a teacher, you have the option of filing a complaint or an application at the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. So that timeline usually is 1 year from the date of the last incident of discrimination. But if you can prove there has been a series of incidents, there's obviously an exception. So we know with anti-Black racism, it's not always overt, it can be subtle, and there can be multiple events that happen. So I will give an example of a recent case that was recently decided on at the tribunal. But it's important to know that when we as a community, and I say this as a Black community, have issues with the school, it's not always just the school that is a respondent. Oftentimes we have a lot of child welfare involvement with education, whether it's the Children's Aid or Catholic Children's Aid, as well as the police. So this case example, JKB at 2020, HRTO 125, so that just means it was recently adjudicated in March of this year. That's a case actually out of Peel Region against the Peel Police. So that's a case of a young child at the time. She was a young 6-year-old Black child, issue at school. Instead of the school handling it correctly, of course, they call the police, which is very normal of what they do. Police come in, this child is hand-tied, tied on her feet, held in this position for about 28 minutes. And I highlight this case because this is a case that shows a precedent of what we have all seen, and it's finally setting a precedent of what happens. So this is a clear example of a clear overreaction, excessive discipline used in our children, and over scrutiny based on race. And it really is differential treatment. Like, would this have happened to a child if they were white? Let's just ask that question. So for today, it's really important when we talk about race, it can be uncomfortable for people, but we have to say it the way it is. We cannot be silent on these issues. If we are silent on these issues, we can't combat it and we can't litigate. So that is one example where they actually found in favor of the child that the Peel Police indeed racially discriminated her based on her race and used excessive discipline.
So that's a great example how the parents actually found the voice and the strength to actually push forward and move forward with respect to advocating for themselves. So my next question is, what can parents do to protect their children against anti-Black racism? Or even following up with schools, right, with respect to advocating against it and identifying it and doing something about it.
So really with parents, the suggestion I have really is that you are really your child's first advocate, whether you're a parent or a guardian. And I would suggest making absolute use of the Ontario College of Teachers, which I'll discuss later. That's a regulatory body. I would suggest making use of that as well. If you can't go to the tribunal or you're uncomfortable, just be familiar with that, and I'll discuss that later. But really, as a parent, you really want to document when things happen, because that is a contemporaneous note you can do. Send yourself an email, send your friend an email. It's a timestamp. It shows when it happened. If you have meetings with the school board, whether it's a superintendent, principal, or even the teacher, if you're uncomfortable, have a support person with you, because oftentimes we just have to be clear what happens. Black parents advocate for their children and they're hit with a no trespass order. We see this across the province. Our office has a provincial mandate. We see this from Kawartha Lakes to Hamilton to Peel. It's very clear. So when you are advocating as a parent or guardian for your child, put things in writing, document, and be really familiar with how to escalate concerns. A part of us being able to advocate is empowering ourselves and knowing where to go. So that'd be my first suggestion for parents is if you have meetings with teachers, superintendents, principals, document everything and be prepared to have a support person with you because they can be your witness too.
If I could follow up on that as well. Great points, Patricia. I also want to emphasize the Ontario College of Teachers, and I think you're going to talk about this as well. But parents should be aware of all the tools available to them to hold teachers, principals, schools, school boards, and the government itself accountable. And granted, the system isn't perfect at all by any means, and certainly many of your requests might go unanswered or not sufficiently addressed. But the significance in making use of these different platforms or forums is in the documentation. So when you contact for example, Ontario College of Teachers to make a complaint or something, it might not pan out. The teacher might not be disciplined. But what you've done is created a paper trail, a record of a complaint. And that in itself is very significant. And as issues continue to mount, you now create a trail of instances in which your issues were not addressed or addressed sufficiently.
And adding to that, if there is a consistent respondent, that will help you in litigation. So if it's the same teacher that's causing the problems, or the same school, or the same school administrator, regardless of their role, a repeat respondent can definitely help too.
So this pretty much just lends us to our follow-up question about the role of the Ontario College of Teachers, because again, with respect to anti-Black racism, it is connected to our institution. And just so everybody knows, like most institutions have regulatory bodies. So like it could be the College of Physicians, College of Nurses, College of Social Workers. So again, depending on which system you're in, back to the Patricia's initial point, continue to, have your voice heard by filing complaints, comments, concerns to these institutions. So kind of circling back to education. So what is the role of the Ontario College of Teachers?
So they set very high standards for the teaching profession. And as I indicated, teaching is a profession. So there is an interest of keeping the public protected. So the same way if someone had a complaint against a lawyer and you can go to the law society, the teachers are the same. So there's no timeline to file a complaint against a teacher. So that's one thing I would like to advise. Oftentimes people think, oh, this happened 2 years ago. They did this to my kid. You can still actually bring that claim. There's actually no timeline to file. But what it does is it holds members of that profession accountable, and any shortfalls are considered, malpractice. It can only be considered malpractice, but it's a start. So if you maybe get a positive finding at the OCT, which is Ontario College of Teachers, potentially you can move forward with a human rights complaint. Even if you don't get a positive feedback, maybe it's unsubstantiated when it's investigated, it will still show a repeat respondent, it will still show a paper trail. So my suggestion in that is, talk to other parents that you have, maybe in your child's classroom. Are other parents still having similar issues with that teacher? Bring your complaint together. Obviously, complaints at those can't be anonymous, but really this is a time for our community to be unified. When we don't hear of certain issues in different school boards, it doesn't mean there are not issues. It just means that no one has spoken up yet. And I really say that for our rural communities in Ontario that have maybe not many people that consider or identify as Black, they're still facing issues, but they don't feel they have a voice because there's not as many of them or they're not unified. So and I will discuss later on what the school board's responsibilities are. There usually are internal complaints mechanisms, and I'll discuss that next.
We could move forward to that second part as to the roles of school boards.
Great. So really with my thoughts are on this. So overall, with school boards, there usually are a human rights policy and procedure, whether it's for visitors of school, parents, guardians, teachers, principals, as well as students. But the issue here is, do they all have a human rights commissioner's office? They all don't. Do they all have clear internal complaint mechanisms that people can use before they escalate a concern to the Ontario College of Teachers or to the Human Rights Tribunal? They don't. And for us as individuals who practice in this area of law, that is a failure of the system in our eyes. When a clear issue of systemic anti-Black racism is shown in the education system, and different school boards are not showing clear anti-oppressive policies, they're not ensuring protections for whistleblowers, it's problematic. And I say that because we also see a lot of calls from teachers in our office where they bring up an issue of anti-Black racism, whether it's for themselves or for a Black child. And instead of the school stepping up, working it out, trying to have an investigation and find out what the problem is, that teacher now has an employment law issue. They often have a very hostile work environment and they can't work. So for us as the Black community, it affects teachers, parents and guardians and students. And I think that's important to recognize what happens, and that's how anti-Black racism manifests. So I see that as a failure. And, you know, people can say, well, there's policies and procedures, and we have policy, 5.4 in Hamilton or policy 53 in Peel. When a policy is in place, but the practice is different, that to me is a deceptive legislation. That means that that is not being followed, and we need to litigate that. So I would just suggest this is the time to be unified. If you have questions, contact a lawyer. You can contact Alex or myself, or you can contact Muna. We work in this area of law and we're happy to answer questions. But really, it's really important that, if that place only has like one human rights officer and then the answer is go to the superintendent, that's not really acceptable. There should be a human rights actual policy and a complaint process where there's a neutral third party doing it and conducting an investigation. So that would just be the role of the school board should be to protect children and parents and teachers. We don't see that happening. We see clear failures. As I mentioned earlier, Black parents and guardians are hit with no trespass orders when there's an issue and they're trying to stand up and advocate for their child. And that's exactly how anti-Black racism manifests. When there is a culture of fear to the community, whether it's from a parent or a teacher, you're not going to advocate if you're scared. But that's something that we need to combat, and we need to work together, and we need to stand unified in that so that we see clear, meaningful, substantive, and systemic changes that aren't just written down, but they're actually practiced.
That's right. And if I could also just add on, obviously these aren't changes that we're proposing or actions, behaviors that we're proposing to change a system. You're working within the system with some of these tools that we are suggesting. And the significance of this, again, I'll repeat it, is the fact that it becomes documented and on record. Patricia actually pointed out that the same laws and policies that we've been talking about must be brought up so we can show the discrepancy between what they're supposed to be doing and what the practices are. When you're able to take those two circumstances and provide it to them and have them get a response to you, you now create a record that can be used against them. And I use them as whatever institution or person that has been alleged to do some form of wrong. So in the context of anti-Black racism, this is incredibly important as a tool. It certainly by no means is a way to create systemic change. This is kind of just putting out one fire as it goes along, but it's a tool that can actually end up being used for systemic change. When we see when we see so many different instances of these same issues, having it on record becomes easier to demonstrate the flaws in the system. And we know that there are flaws in the system, but the irony of all this is we have to wait until, in many instances, actually have information, data to show it. As Black people, we know anecdotally and from experiences that these are very real practices against us. But in the system that we have as is, it usually is more impactful to be able to provide some hard evidence to support whatever it is that we have experienced.
So my follow-up question is, what can students do to protect their rights? Because I guess I think about myself growing up here as a Black child in Hamilton. Sometimes you're not even aware what is actually happening to you is actually, anti-Black racism, and that you're just being treated this way. So what can students do to protect themselves and even advocate for themselves?
So of course, it obviously depends on the age of the student and capacity, but for some of our kids on the phone today that are in high school, really, check in with your parent and guardian and let them know what's happening. Speak openly with your family, speak candidly with your friends, and really reach out and use community resources that are here to provide support. So it doesn't always have to be a lawyer. I mean, there are many, many programs across the province, whether it's Pathways to Education, If you have a caseworker there, talk to your caseworker. If you're involved in a Black student committee or Black student organization, or even if there's a Black Parents Association, check in with them, let them know what's happening. Because again, we are stronger when we have numbers, but we're also stronger when we're unified. So that would just be my suggestion. And really, again, the onus should be on parents and guardians. Check in with your kids, even if they're 5 years old. How was your day? What happened? That case I highlighted earlier, that child was only 6 and she was handcuffed. So it's so important for us to have that open dialogue and open communication.
I'm just going to add, if I may, to that. I think that there's also something to be said about students or parents or guardians not allowing themselves to be sort of part of an internal process, because oftentimes internal process mean that, you know, you are not privy to the information that is taking place, and so you may think that a decision will be forthcoming, but time will pass by, and then, you know, it may result into like just a slap on the wrist, or that information may just get lost, and so then another child or student or parent will have to start from scratch again, dealing with the same institution. So sometimes it's best to put things out in the public, right? It's wonderful to also organize and collaborate. You know, I'm just going to go back again to this termination of this program. You know, it wasn't enough that students, along with their guardians, have expressed concerns about these programs, have brought it to the attention of teachers, principals, trustees, but it was only when it was out in the public and that other even members of the community were aware of it and got on board and supported, and that boards had no other choice but to look at this issue that was facing them on a platform such as social media, or even in the streets, right? Physically, it was in their face that this was a problem and that a campaign had to be put in place, that this then changed, and that a positive result was met thanks to the community. And so oftentimes, you know, the idea of having these conversations or complaints in an office setting is helpful, and that is the initial step, that yes, you should follow the rules, take that into consideration, definitely document every interaction, the times, the persons, what they said, what you said, what was the agreement on. If you have to paraphrase in the middle of that discussion, paraphrase, right? But there's a moment that happens when you will, unfortunately, show and demonstrate how this is affecting and harming your child. You will talk about the gaps in a policy. You will seek legal advice, and yet nothing will change. And so we always have that arsenal in our back, which is the collective and the community, and what we can do as a group of people who care for the well-being of their children, like any other group, right? What we can do once we come together, once we organize, mobilize, but most importantly, strategize. And so I would strongly suggest that we don't assume that if the proper channels haven't worked, then oh well, it is over and done with. In many instances of change in this city and anywhere else in this province, that work has been done on the back of racialized and Black parents, grandparents, guardians, everybody. It has been done, and it has been done because they were not willing to stop and end it at just being told no. So we also have that ability.
Agreed. And sorry, Muna, if I could just add on as well, those were some great points. And let's not treat, to your point, let's not treat working through the internal mechanisms and publicly raising these things to the community as either or. It's not. And oftentimes, these are just two things that are typically what allow for institutional change: litigation and public shaming. Those are the two kind of things that really get the results that we often are looking for. In litigation, and a lot of this sets itself up for that by documenting everything, because it now creates precedent in case law and things that can help people in the future. And again, the law isn't perfect, the justice system isn't perfect, but it creates a system of accountability now that can be used for other things in the future. And public shaming is just as powerful. It creates, it puts all eyes on this institution that also gets the pressure for change. So it's not either or, and many times both have to happen for the sufficient change that we want to see.
Agreed, appreciated. So that kind of brings us to the closing of our discussion. So again, I'd like to thank the panelists, Alex, Mona, and Patricia. But before we close, and I realized initially, I'm just gonna out myself at the beginning, I kind of went off script, so I really read about what anti-Black racism is. So I wanna actually throw it back to Mona, just in case if there was something that I totally mashed up or debacled in that initial part, and if there was anything or any additional parts or comments before we do any kind of closing remarks, and then throw it out to our audience participants so we can have some questions answered.
It's all good, Danielle. You did wonderful. No, you actually
You are too kind.
You saved me from talking so much about the difference between, because I think a lot of people wondered, well, what is anti-Black racism as opposed to just regular racism, right? So I think you've explained it very well, and I think we've we clarified that it is essentially a segment. It's part of this other insidious illness that we have in our society, which is racism. So it definitely flows together, but one is clearly directed at those with the darker skin tones. Yeah.
Oh, so just any kind of closing remarks or comments that you would like to share, and then I can ask Alex and Patricia. Just maybe like your one take home, I guess, from the advice that you provided. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, first of all, thank you so much, Alex, for calling us all on board to do this. I think it's important that we provide information, and I think my colleagues will agree that we want to share legal information as much as possible with our community. We want parents and youth to know what their rights are, and once you have the knowledge, you have the power, you have the confidence to stand up for your right, to know where to seek additional support if you need to, what to say, what not to say, who to answer to. And so I'm really appreciative of platforms like these where we can just provide information as much as possible. And I just hope that, if anything, this will give another set of energy to those that are listening, that nothing is done without us. And if you really want meaningful change to take place, you need to get involved. We all need to get involved. We all need to come to this table and have these conversations. And to those that are finding this difficult and uncomfortable, it's okay. It's meant to be difficult and uncomfortable, but without it, we cannot move forward. And we need everyone, again, around the table. And I just want to also I guess acknowledge the educators, Black educators, that are sort of in this difficult space where they are isolated, they are silenced, and oftentimes tokenized for the sheer fact that they are trying to do the work while understanding the needs of communities, and they're not always supported. And I know some teachers feel also as though they don't know how and where and what to do. They may not have the right words to express themselves and the resources, but you must start somewhere. We have to start somewhere. And if you don't know where to start, reach out to us, connect with us. There are many in this city alone that do this type of work and have done it for far longer than myself and Alex, I'm sure. So please reach out if you are unsure, but you cannot sit aside and watch from the sidelines. It's either you get involved, or unfortunately your silence, and our silence, our collective silence, will certainly hurt us. Thank you. That's all I have
Thank
to say.
you. Patricia, any closing comments?
Well, thank you for having me. It's absolutely been a pleasure. I do represent the Black Legal Action Center. So really, I would just comment that if someone has an issue of anti-Black racism in education, call our office. This is an area of law that we absolutely provide practice and supports with. But my real take home really with anti-Black racism in education is when it manifests, it affects us all, from students, parents, teachers, principal. It's everybody. So it's so important for us to understand that. And if we do not combat it, if we stay silent on these issues, they'll get away with it. If you're a teacher, contact your union, try to get the supports that you can, because again, you're not the only one. And that's why I really want that takeaway today is it's a systemic issue across different school boards all over the province of Ontario. Please don't feel like it's just you. If you're a parent or guardian or a child, please do not feel like this is just you. Until we normalize that this is a problem and the system is failing us, we will not have any change. So that's really my takeaway for today is don't remain silent on this and don't be scared to litigate.
Thank you. And Alex, before we open it up to audience questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for participating, and I'm hoping that the thing that you walk away with is that our system definitely is unfair in many ways. And I think it comes down to the lack of accountability in many instances, because laws and rules are there to support our students in many ways, but it's the lack of accountability that creates the failure of the system, in my opinion. What I'm hoping this conversation has allowed for is some more insight into some of the rules, policies, laws that are there to support students, teachers, and members of the Black community. What we as members of the community need to do, and this isn't just the Black community, this is all community, racialized and non-racialized, we need to hold the system accountable. It doesn't start and end at one person, and we need to hold the system accountable to the rules and policies that it's supposed to be following. So hopefully that is a bit of a takeaway. The support systems that are available are the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, the Black Legal Action Center, and many advocates across the province in a legal capacity. However, there are many other organizations, non-legal, that are doing work as advocates as well. Empowerment Squared is a very big advocate for many of the young people in our community, and every community across Ontario certainly has its own community members who are speaking up about these many challenges that our school system faces. So thank you again for participating, and I hope you walk away with a little bit more tools in your toolkit to be able to combat some of these outrageous things that are going on in the system.
Thank you. I really appreciate this conversation today. I just even think about myself as, for the longest time, I think it was only until high school that I was the only Black child in class. And I think about what would it have meant to my education if my parents had been resourced with this information? Like, would the trajectory of my educational path, like I'm happy to say that I am successful right now in life, but you just kind of wonder, based on the information that you're sharing here today, and again, with what we have been seeing in the media with different school boards, even with respect to students, even here in Hamilton, not too long ago, really with respect to advocating for their rights and really holding administration, school boards, accountable. So I hope that, especially for the students and our educators, our parents, and even us as a community as a whole, the importance of the information that we obtained here today, and really linking that to really making and addressing anti-Black racism. So I'm now just going to go through the list of questions that were generated in the chat throughout the conversation. So just kind of, so Kathy McDonald stated in the chat that remember that streaming really unofficially starts from the moment our children enter the educational system. In kindergarten, our children are labeled as future gang leaders. How can anyone teach a future gang leader? So I know, Mona, you were the one that actually spoke about the streaming. So just any kind of thoughts that kind of come to mind with respect to this statement. And it is unfortunately a label that I have heard myself, and I'm sure many of us have, with respect to Black children.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you hear things like that, no matter the amount of times that you've heard it, it is always disheartening, as though it's the first time you hear it, right? But I think ultimately what my colleagues have so well said is that there are mechanisms in place for parents to know, document, and seek support, right? And so a parent knows best. They know what their child is capable of. They know what they excel in. And so walking into a classroom, sometimes you will experience instantly what is making your child uncomfortable. How is your child feeling in that space? And so listening to your child, taking their cues, you know, and it's not always verbal, but their cues as to the ways that they feel in their classroom, or when their class is brought up or their teacher is brought up. And then essentially following the channels that are already in place. And when those don't work, and we do know sometimes, and in many cases they do not work, then do, as we have said here in this discussion, seek legal support, you know, report teachers, file a human rights complaint if your human rights have been violated, or your child's human rights have been violated, but never take into consideration the fact that your child may be, you know, may have lower expectations. That is never something that a parent should believe and take into consideration. And I especially say this because in the event that there may be those listening to this discussion that have beliefs of, you know, providing and respecting the teacher, and providing information to the teacher and listening to the teacher, and as though the teacher's word is essentially bond. Well, it isn't. You know, teachers have their input, and they have their feedback, but it comes back to the parent and the guardian to consistently advocate and support their child in ensuring that they, you know, meet all of their goals and their objectives and dreams. So I would simply say to not feel defeated. You are not alone in this, in that type of situation. We have parents that are having issues, unfortunately, from kindergarten to high school, and that's after changing either elementary schools on a few occasions and high schools again on a few occasions. So it isn't anything unique to a specific person or a specific issue. It is a systemic problem all over this country that we are seeing, and I hope that parents will not feel defeated and essentially allow that to fester. You know, noticing these issues in JK is one thing, but allowing it to go to SK and grade 1 and so on is unacceptable.
Thank you. Another question we have from Sheila Patel. She spoke of, she reported an incident of anti-Black racism to an external HR investigator. Nothing was actually done. Later in the fall, the principal was simply moved to another school. How, as an employee, can we hold management accountable? So I'm not too sure if Alex or Patricia, who would like to take this question.
So I can start it off if Alex wants to go after, but I would suggest the first place to start is if you want to if you identify as Black, contact our office at Black, and I'd be happy to go over the investigation with you to see what actually occurred. But oftentimes you still have options to file a human rights complaint like Mona had suggested, and also contact your union. Oftentimes there are policies and procedures that are there to protect teachers. Again, if it's deceptive, it is not followed, file a human rights complaint. That would be my suggestion. But really for that kind of question, it can be really detailed on the strategy followed. So I would have someone actually read over that investigation report.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm just gonna use this time to have two of our wonderful community members from Hamilton speak a little bit more about some of their positions as it relates to anti-Black racism in the education system. So Greg, I'm just gonna ask that you go ahead and introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit more about what it is that you wanted to share with us today.
Would you actually be able to unmute Batul as well? Just so
Yeah,
she can
sure.
add to just so she can add to what I would like to say.
Of course.
So I'd first like to start this off by initially saying that anti-Black racism is a huge, massive fight that we are all fighting and we continue to fight. It's through a lot of the work that some of these youth in our city have done that some of the outcomes came the way they have. But another thing to be aware of is in this space of organizing against anti-Black racism and anti-Black racism is gatekeepers who sometimes do not allow you to have the space in certain rooms. There's also stuff like that that happens all the time in a ton of other organizations, similar to what happened through this call. But that's not even the biggest issue I want to speak on today. The biggest issue I wanted to speak on was anti-Black racism as a whole. Me and the HWDSB Kids Needs Help have been fighting for 4 years. I've only recently joined this. Batul, if you're able to unmute yourself now, I'm not sure if they actually granted you the ability to co-host, or if we're still stuck at the stage where we have to ask permission to speak. I don't know how this works anymore. 1 second. Batul,
Batul has been on, she has the ability to unmute herself, so
Okay, I just wasn't sure, most of the call we haven't been able to speak. So it's, a little choppy, we're not too sure. So like I was saying, in regards to how the HWDSB Kids Needs Help have been contributing with this issue, the HWDSB Kids Needs Help have spoken to various different organizations, have spoken to a ton of parents, have spoken to students who deal with this issue on a day-to-day. Anti-Black racism in schools manifests itself through teachers, through students, through principals, through everybody in that building. The institution itself is ridiculous. Batul is also still muted. Sorry. Anti-Black racism is Anti-Black racism also manifested itself at the school board level when we had to fight for our reason to vote, fight for the motion to get on the agenda for the creation of the police liaison program. Anti-Black racism is ridiculous, especially in the school board, because at the end of the day, through the suspension of the Black Youth Mentorship Program, we saw the hypocrisy at the school board level, because they were not willing to also suspend the police liaison program when it first came to table and it first came under investigation. The school board also diminished and canceled our program as soon as they heard that one of our students spoke out at a press conference. So any voice of reason or any freedom of speech the students really did have was kiboshed as soon as we were given a chance to speak. The school board paused our program, but allowed the police program to continue. This is after we have numerous accounts and testimonials of issues that students have faced with the police. Also, we all had numerous community members come out talking about issues they faced with the police. So for us to ask for them to terminate the police program was not a big ask, was not a big issue. We had trustees claiming they had no information or they had no clue that anti-Black racism or how the police liaison program affected students. If you Google the disproportionate impact on Black students in Ontario, you can read the impacts it clearly has on students, not only the police and but also principals on students. If you ask any Black student what their interaction was with the police in their school, you will hear a story. There's no questions asked. No questions asked. If you look to any racialized folk, you'll hear just as much stories as you look to any other, like
So
anti-Black.
Gregory, sorry, Greg, just to kind of, because you're giving us like a lot of examples about certain incidences and experiences. So I guess my one question to you would be, because I understand you are a student, so what would be your one take home or advice to give to, educators, parents, with respect to the work that you're doing and what, we could be doing to advocate anti-Black racism?
I almost did get to that point.
Okay.
I'm on my way there. Like I was saying, the amount of ridiculousness we face from the board level, from school level, from principal level is ridiculous because at the end of the day, you whether you're pushing for change within the school at a school board level through either a Black youth council or even another different group or any advocacy group looking for a concrete result for some of the issues you face or some of the issues that are brought up in regards to anti-Black racism, you will either get called a threat in your school, you will get called a nigger, you'll get called all types of things when you are facing very real incidents or very real inquests of anti-Black racism in the school. Um, I'm I'm talking about some of the issues we faced, but Batul is willing and ready to initially give the backstory and kind of what we fought for so long and why we have. Go ahead, Batul.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Don't forget to introduce yourself since we were introduced.
So my name is Batul. I am one of the organizers and members of part of HWSB Kids Need Help. And Greg and I were kind of invited to speak on this panel about what racism looks like in schools. And I wanted to just start off by talking about HWSB Kids' history. We started off about 4 years ago after a blatant incident of anti-racism police violence in schools. We've been organized for the last 4 years. The most recent, we got the police program terminated. We've played as students, we've taken on the role and the burden of kind of organizing and doing this anti-racist work has fallen on students within the schools. So our organization is essentially made up of students who are currently in schools and students who have graduated from high school. And all of the change that has been made and that has come to the school board has been done by HWSB Kids and by student organizers and by community organizers. The motion that was actually put in place to terminate the police program was written and put in place by the Equity Advisory Committee, which is comprised of community organizers. And so it's important that when we're doing this work and then when we're having these conversations, we're constantly including and talking to the community members that are doing this work and that are kind of on the front lines of this work. It's important that we're including them in these conversations. It was also mentioned earlier that we need to be building positive relationships with police but I want to also make note of the fact that you can't expect students and you can't expect Black students specifically to be building positive relationships with police when this institution is inherently violent and is inherently anti-Black. And so I just wanted to also make that clear. One thing I also wanted to mention was the demands that were put into place by the community members, specifically the demand to defund and abolish the Hamilton Police. This is just an example of the work that these students and that community organizers are continuously doing. And it's important that we are supporting this work and that we're acknowledging this work and that we're having these conversations with these students.
Like like I think it was Alex said, we make the choice to either litigate or publicly embarrass those who have not really I guess been willing to take that equity lens or that sense of equity and or equality. So what ended up happening for I 100% believe that should we not have done this, we would not have gotten the police liaison and the SRO program terminated. In order for that to happen, we had a action planned. We sat down in the middle of the road. We had a sit-in. We sat in the middle of the road for 6 hours. This is something I doubt half of you guys have organized or tried to put together before the age of 19. I'm a 19-year-old. There are 20-year-olds. There are people who are not even 25 doing this work, pushing for a change that we want our kids to see, that we want the future to see. And at the end of the day, we will not stop. We had rain come down on us while we were outside waiting for them to finish the vote, where we had rain come down on us, pouring rain was stormed. We handed out ponchos. We had stuff happen to the speakers of which we couldn't play the music or we couldn't play the live feed of the school board vote. We switched it over to U-Hauls. It's that innovativeness that we need to continue to do, and we will continue to do in regards to anti-Black racism. And it's through the work of the youth that are currently on the front lines and in the face of these issues that that have been that we've been getting these concrete results. And I don't doubt that. I don't doubt. I personally know that if the HWDSB Kids Needs Help did not exist, the school liaison program and the school resource officer program would continue. And
Yeah.
it would
Yeah, Greg, no, I completely agree. And I just want to take a moment just to heartfelt apology. There was some miscommunication and I will take full responsibility for that. I apologize for not getting you guys the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm glad that we're hearing from you now, and I definitely don't want to undermine your efforts at all. In fact, I think it's incredibly significant, the work that our young people, especially the group in Hamilton, has been doing with the board, advocating against the issues that have been affecting you and generations of students in the past. So thank you guys for that work. And I don't think we can actually truly emphasize how significant it is. The work that you have to do is going to only keep going, right? There's so many deep issues in this education system. And I'm glad that you guys are able to do so from that perspective and that lens. I'm glad that we have community members from across Ontario with varying capacities and abilities to be able to advocate for this education system that has a legacy of anti-Black racism. So on behalf of all the panelists, I want to say thank you both for those perspectives. Very helpful and very significant to this discussion. My only error that I want to be able to make it clear today is that I regret not having that included in a conversation earlier throughout this session. But if you guys don't have anything else to add, I'll pass it back to Danielle.
I also wanted to add one last statement. So just after the march, the walkout we did at Bernie Custis, there were flyers posted around our school that said, it said, the oppressed did not ask for their dignity back politely. So it's up to us to take it back.
That's right.
In my eyes, that means it's been, we are the oppressed, and we no longer have the ability to sit here and wait for a temporary appeasement to wait us out or exhaust us or have outlive us. It's our time now to make a change in the infrastructure that we've been living in. We no longer have the ability to sit by and watch people get killed in the media. We shouldn't have left it to that point. It's at the point now of which we need to transcend what we've been doing so far, and we need to make that social change as a people. Um, that's why I personally, same with Batul and a other massive group of Hamilton organizers, have been pushing for the defunding of the police. Um, the police budget was over half of the city's operating cost, 171 million. So that beats all the social services we have in our city, all of the construction, all of the roads, all of the city's operational costs. And I think it's time we change that too as well and allocate that to the different social services we know can help our community.
Definitely. And I think that's a broader conversation we're going to have. But we're going to wrap it up for this evening. And I definitely want to be able to have a conversation with the young people in Hamilton about the education system in the future. So I'm definitely going to be inviting you guys back with a more substantive role in the conversation. I promise you, we do want to hear from you. And again, I just want to reiterate my apologies, and I'll take every effort to make sure that we hear from you and your perspectives in our future conversations. Danielle, I'm going to just have you wrap it up for us. I don't want our guests to stay too much longer this afternoon. I know it's beautiful weather, a beautiful stretch of weather that we've been getting. So there you go.
This pretty much brings it to the end of our discussion. Again, I'd like to thank Empowerment Square for hosting today. I'd actually like to thank Greg and Batul. Unfortunately, time ran out with respect to, as Alex said, the oversight of not including you guys in the conversation. I hope this actually just leads to, hopefully you guys would be willing to engage in a secondary conversation that is actually more youth-led, because even with respect to some of the comments that we do have in the chat, especially since defunding the police and the impact of policing in schools, and I think it's actually a key component because you guys, the youth, are the ones actually living in the actual systems that we are trying to change. And it actually makes sense that this conversation should be led by you, for you, because these are the systems that we are trying to change. So again, I would just like to extend further apologies, and I just hope that working relationships can still continue, right? We all learn from these mistakes, but we can do better. I'd also too just like to thank our additional panelists, Alex as well, for bringing us together, and Mona and Patricia. So I know for this part, I was actually just supposed to kind of throw it back to you, Alex, about upcoming Empowerment Square programs, and before we close for the evening.
Yeah, so just for our audience, I just wanted to let you know that Empowerment Squared is running some summer programming, social distance summer programming, and the registration deadline is next week, Monday, for that. So check it out on the empowermentsquared.org website for more details. And our next conversation will be about understanding Ontario's education system. So we at Empowerment Squared have the program called Hamilton Education Law Program. And this is just one of a series of different conversations that we hope to have over the summer months. So the next conversation will be on July 21st, 2020, and it will be called Understanding Ontario's Education System. We'll learn about the different components of the system and how you can potentially use that system to get the change you want, advocate for yourself and your children, or as a community member, how can you have your voice heard? So that is what I'm going to leave it off with for today. The next slide is just going to be our contact information. Should you want to reach out to any of the panelists for any questions that you may have to follow up. And thank you again on behalf of all the panelists today for attending this conversation. We hope that you'll be a part of future conversations. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.